Today on Substance Stories, we're going to be busting some myths about cannabis. Welcome to Substance Stories. I've just gotten back from going to a conference in the US, and when I was in the US, I noticed that a lot of people are smoking cannabis. You can buy it legally in most states, and my goodness, are people buying it legally and using it. And when I was there, I was having interesting chats with a lot of people. And what I noticed was there's a lot of misconceptions about cannabis in the US that I want to bust. So I'm going to start busting some cannabis facts today. The first myth I want to bust, which I was very surprised to hear as an addiction psychiatrist, is people were telling me cannabis isn't addictive. Well, as we know and as we've talked about, any substance is addictive, right? An addiction is not about the substance. It's about us trying to escape hardships and trying to cope with difficulties in life. And what happens is we become too reliant on one thing and it ends up causing more damage. It's a maladaptive coping mechanism. So that's why you can get addicted to any sort of short, pleasurable seeking behaviour or substance. Cannabis itself, though, is highly addictive. Yeah, THC is a pleasure-providing substance, and it really does reinforce its behaviour very quickly, and it's absolutely addictive. As we've talked about with addiction, the way you use it matters. So if I'm eating THC, it's going to be less reinforcing because there's more time difference between when I took the drug and when I felt the effect than if I smoked THC. But absolutely, cannabis is addictive. I was very shocked to hear people say that. The second thing that I heard people say that, again, I was shocked to hear, is that cannabis doesn't cause psychosis or doesn't cause schizophrenia. So the evidence is really, really clear now that cannabis causes schizophrenia and psychosis, probably increases your risk of getting schizophrenia by about 6 times, which, I think if you are born with no sort of extra risks, your risk of getting schizophrenia about 1%. So if you then smoked cannabis heavily, it would go up to 6%. And that is with heavy use, the 6 times. But if I had a family member who had schizophrenia, then my risk of getting schizophrenia would be about 10%. So then if I started smoking cannabis heavily, my risk goes up to 60%, right? Which is quite a different calculation. What is it in cannabis that makes us pro-psychotic? Well, that would be THC. There are lots of different substances in cannabis. We call them cannabinoids. THC is the one that brings about the pleasure. It also brings around the psychotic symptoms and the side effects. So there's pleasure and pain with THC. And what we've seen in recent years is because it brings about the pleasure and because we're making so much cannabis to sell and we're getting good at designing the cannabis, through selective breeding, we have gotten a lot stronger cannabis. In fact, some of the places in Australia will sell cannabis, medicinal cannabis, 30% THC, which is incredibly strong cannabis. That has resulted in higher risks of psychosis from this cannabis. So keep in mind, if you are using cannabis heavily, well, if you're using any substance heavily, I really would question your relationship to that substance. But if you're using cannabis, really do keep in mind the risk of psychosis, especially if you are younger. I know people are going to say in the comments, oh, people use cannabis to treat their mental illness. And absolutely they do. I wouldn't say treat because that implies it's helping the mental illness where it's not. It's almost certainly making the mental illness worse. But they are using it to cope with having a mental illness. And I fully get that. All drug use is bidirectional. It comes about because of mental illness, but it also increases our risk of getting mental illness. So just because we're using something to cope with something does not mean it is not also causing us harm. One of the interesting things we see with cannabis and psychosis is we see that people will go through withdrawal and then often they'll get psychosis. And why this happens is that THC, that substance I was talking about earlier, it's absorbed into our fat. The other cannabinoids aren't. So if I stop smoking cannabis, over the next weeks to months, I'm going to have a slow leaking of THC into my system, especially if I do something like, have run at a calorie deficit or exercise a lot, I'll bring out more THC into my system as my body uses its fat stores. So this is absolutely relevant for people that can get psychosis in cannabis withdrawal, but it's also relevant for what I'm going to talk about next, which is cannabis hyperemesis syndrome. So this is when we smoke cannabis and we just cannot stop uncontrollably vomiting. So just like psychosis, we've seen this rise in recent years because THC content in cannabis has risen a lot. And just like psychosis, it can happen a lot in withdrawal. And so people will often say to me, I can't stop smoking my cannabis because I start vomiting uncontrollably. Well, what's happening there is the other cannabinoids are having an antiemetic effect. So they're stopping us from vomiting. But once we stop smoking, they go away and we still get that THC leaking throughout out of our fat cells. Now, THC hyperemesis is notable because people will often get in warm showers because warmth gets rid of it. What's happening is our bodies, our guts have just been overwhelmed by THC, and how they're regulating what to vomit and what not is completely put askew. So we're just going to vomit uncontrollably. But our guts are very, very sensitive to temperature changes. Some people have noticed this when they get very drunk and they crawl on the bathroom floor to vomit, but the cool tiles of the bathroom mean that they don't vomit. People notice this in cannabis hyperemesis syndrome. They end up getting in a warm shower and staying there all day. You can also get capsaicin cream, capsaicin is the substance that makes chilies hot. You can get it in a cream and you can rub it on your belly. You won't vomit anymore. But the only long-term cure to this is cannabis cessation. You need to get rid of the THC from your system. There is no other way around this. And once you've been sensitized to cannabis hyperemesis syndrome, you will basically vomit every time you start smoking cannabis. So there's only one way to cure cannabis hyperemesis syndrome, and that's stopping smoking cannabis. And finally, and this one I think is really important. There's a lot of prescribed cannabis. Medicinal cannabis seems to be the way a lot of countries and a lot of jurisdictions have gone between legalizing cannabis for recreational use and making it fully illegal. There's this half zone between medicinal cannabis. Now, I find this very confusing as a doctor because all substances are legal medicinally if there is an indication for them. Heroin can be prescribed in hospitals. Cocaine is routinely prescribed in hospitals. Ketamine is prescribed in hospitals. We know that if a substance has a medicinal purpose, we use it. Medicinal cannabis, unfortunately, does not have any approved uses in Australia. It's only available under a special access scheme, and that's because the evidence says that it's not really good at helping for much. There are some very, very rare syndromes that need that it can help for epilepsy, and that is it. So there's a thing called Dravet syndrome, but that's really CBD as well rather than THC. Yet we are prescribing an awful lot of medicinal cannabis. The main indications for that in Australia are anxiety, insomnia, and pain, all of which have not been demonstrated to be helped significantly by cannabis, some of which cannabis actually makes worse. So why are we prescribing such cannabis? Well, my view is this is a way that Australia has sort of pseudo-legalized cannabis. And why I want to mention this is because this is not helping people. And I've had many people come to me who have been addicted to cannabis, prescribed by a doctor who I've had to help get off the cannabis, and then I've treated their underlying conditions, and their life has got a lot better. So I'm really, really distressed by the medicinal cannabis industry, especially in Australia, and I want people that are getting medicinal cannabis to not just have a blind faith in a system that is supposed to be helping them, because I don't think the system is currently helping people. I think the system is currently designed to sell people recreational cannabis under the guise of medicinal cannabis and make some doctors and cannabis growers very wealthy in Australia, but I don't think it's helping people. And I really, really want you to question whether that cannabis that you are getting prescribed is helping you, and question whether it's just another way of sort of numbing your feelings and it's going to have long-term negative health consequences. Thank you so much for listening. This has been Substance Story.